So it's time to get some electrics done outside. So I'm planning to draw a cable all the way from my garage so that I can light up my pergola, deck and the fish pond over there. And while I'm at it, I'll also put in a few switch socket at that side. So now, from behind the garage, I'll have an RCD box, and from there I'll draw some SWA cable and run it along the length of the entire house, and that will be around 9 feet from the floor. And once it turns the corner, I'll have the cable run down and have a switch socket at that side and a junction box there. And from the junction box, I'll run a cable all the way to the other end of my pergola so that I can get lights up for the pergola and the whole lot. So what you see here is a SWA cable. So this is the armored cable, and I got two set of lengths, one which is 10 meter long and the other one which is 25 meter long. So this is a 13 amp switched fuse spur, and that will be inside the garage. All these are just weatherproof junction boxes. The cable will be held by these cable clips. And over here you got a 2-gang IP66 rated switch socket. That's a 13 amp IP66 power connector 5-way switch. Each of the 5 connectors that you see below will be used to connect different things around the garden. So this is how the switch socket looks like. It's made out of robust polycarbonate housing, UV stabilized, and it's rated at IP66. So you do need IP66 and above so that you don't get rain and dust and all that building up in your electrical circuits. I will run through this installation of this later down the video. And this is the 5-way power controller switch. So the main idea why I bought this is to control lights on my deck, pergola and on the fish pond, and probably I'll run lights at a later stage. This is a 13 amp fuse per unit which will be installed inside the garage. So now let's take a look at the SWA cable. So you can see that's got an outer sheathing, steel wire, inner sheathing, and then the 3 conduits inside, which is 1.5 mm. You need to use a SDS drill if you have, so that you can drill a hole right from the outside into the internal side of the garage wall, so that you can just slide your cable through it. This is the switched fused spur that we saw earlier. So here I'm just going to knock out some of the cable holes. So this will be connected to an existing switch in the garage, and the SWA cable to the outside world will run from this. And then I'm going to use a twin and earth flat cable for this. This is some leftover cable which I had from my loft wiring. If it is possible, do use a flex cable at this point. And using a wire stripper, make sure that you strip all the edges for a clean connection. And then use the earth sleeve on the earth side of the cable, and just make sure that you connect everything properly. That is, the live goes into live, neutral to neutral, and earth into the earth. Give it a gentle tug to make sure that all the connections are correct. And next, connect the wires onto the plug. While working with SWA cable, make sure you have a hacksaw, a wire stripper, a tin snip, pliers and a good Stanley knife. So using the knife, remove the outer sheathing, and then once it's done, you could either use a tin snip, or if you have had used a hacksaw, this part could have easily come out by just moving it backwards and forwards, and I'll show you that later down the video. So once that's done, make sure you remove this inner sheathing, and then with the bare wires which you have, use a wire stripper and make sure you got like a centimeter or so of the back copper wire standing out. So once it's done, slide that into the box and then make sure that you connect the wires onto the appropriate terminals on your fuse spur. The instructions to connect the wiring is actually provided on the fuse spur's manual. So just follow that and it's pretty straightforward since you got only a live terminal, a neutral and an earth. Next, connect a cable from the earth of the box, and this at a later stage needs to be attached onto the earth on the spur. And then screw the back plate onto the wall. And now add silicone all over the place where it's exposed to the elements. So to connect the SWA cable onto the wall, I'm going to use a spacer of 18 inches. Here I'm marking it on the wall with a sketch pen so that it's easy for me to just take the drill and then go along and drill all the holes required. The holes are required to hold the cable cleats which will hold the SWA cable in line. So with the holes drilled, now I can attach the cable cleats to hold the cable in place. So this is basically a procedure which needs to be repeated all across. I used 18 inches to start off with, but later after I finished recording this video, I went in and added an extra cleat in between every 18 inches so that it looks like it had one every 9 inches. On the corner of the wall, I use this plastic packer so that it protects the wall from being damaged. This is entirely optional and you actually don't have to do it, but it adds a nice touch if you do want to. To connect the SWA cable onto all these terminals, you have to use this cable glands. So this cable gland is IP66 rated and it comes with a few different pieces onto it. So it's called the rubber shroud, the earth nut, and this is the actual gland itself, and this consists of 3 pieces. The outside one is the actual one where it has rubber inside, which if you see it closely, and this expands when you tighten it up and provides the waterproof fitting. The second piece over here is the main nut, and inside that there's a brass olive ring. The third part is the one which actually is a tapered core on the end on which the SWA cable slides through and the steel cables will be on it. The olive will hold that in place and the main nut will lock that in place. And finally you got the locking nut. So inside the box you actually lock it like that. Now let's go ahead and see how it's done. So press the SWA cable against this rubber shroud so that it creates a mark over here. Then use a Stanley knife and cut off the tip, and then remove the rubber shroud back and then insert it the opposite way. Next, use a knife to mark the line where you have to cut. Then use a hacksaw and go through the rubber sheeting. While using the hacksaw, make sure that you slightly graze over the steel wires so that it's easy and it breaks off just like that. For any steel wire which doesn't come off, just move it backwards and forwards and it will just drop off. If it doesn't, use a snip to cut it off. Now leave an inch or so and then just gently mark it with your knife, and when you move the cable backwards and forwards, this inner sheeting will just slide off. You need to use a little bit of pressure, and once you pull it like what I'm showing you right now, you'll be left with the 3 cable conductors inside. So first slide the first part of the sealing nut. This is a weatherproofing one with the rubber gaskets on it. Then slide in the main nut and just loosely tighten it so that it doesn't slide all over the place. And then put in the actual fitting with the tapered cone shaped part. Slide the olive onto it so that it holds all the steel armor in place, and then tighten the main nut onto it. Once it's finger tight, use 2 adjustable pliers to tighten it completely. In case if you're overwhelmed with all this, I will leave a link in the description below onto another video by a person called John Wall. He's got a good collection of videos and he explains it absolutely superb. Now that the olive has sealed in the steel wire cable, tighten the first bit of it, and when you do this, this will push the rubber inside the outer nut and give you a waterproof seal. You can see that there's absolutely no gap left in this now. So now on this rear case or the switch socket, make sure you drill out the screw holes, and then over here, that's the rear area where any condensation or rainwater which gets into the box has some area to flow out. So now slide in the SWA cable gland, you put the earth tag, and then with the locking nut, make sure you screw that in place. So with the wire stripper, make sure you have the conductors exposed. And over here, I'm just placing the actual socket onto it and making sure that the length of the wire is exactly how it should be. So you can see in this case that the neutral is a bit smaller in length, so I just chopped it off to the correct length and then stripped it out in place. That's the earth wire. So I put in a tubing of that to show that it's the earth wire, and then I made sure I connected the earth from the SWA gland to the earth on the box, and from there I tapped in another earth cable which will eventually go into the actual switch. I'll show that later down in the video. So that's the junction box, and I tapped out a few holes on all the sides which I need. So I started off with threading the SWA cable which gets connected to the switch socket, and I repeated the same procedure which I did a few minutes ago. That is, tighten up the locking nut and connect the earth wire onto it. With the wiring done up to the junction box, let's take a look at how the power controller looks inside. So you can see it's got 5 rubberized switches over here, and on the left hand side of the box is where the input power supply comes in. So remove the tab and the gland which comes along with the power controller. And then pop out the small grey tabs. These are covers for the screw holes which you need to drill it out later. Now this has got a straightforward instruction, just a live, neutral and earth, and the wiring diagram is there on the box itself, and it's also there in the user manual. So you got 5 outlets. So the advantage of this is that you can control which switch you turn on. So you could have one for the pond, you could have one for the UV filter, you could have one for the deck, and you can have one for the pergola, and so on and so forth. The wiring is straightforward, as I mentioned before. You just have the live, neutral and earth coming in. So tighten it up cleanly. And then screw it down using the hold down clamps. And then turn the cable gland again. This one is a lot simpler in that it's just a polycarbonate fitting, so you can easily tighten it up and it'll give you a good watertight fit. So here I'm just drilling all the screw holes required to fit it outside. This whole unit is a sealed unit, so they have not mentioned of drilling out a drain hole. And since they didn't mention, I didn't do it as well. So you can see I ran the whole cable from the other side of my pergola to the right hand side. And here I'm just marking the position on where the actual controller needs to sit on the wall. And I proceeded to mark it with a pencil, and I did the drilling the same way as I mentioned before. That is, lightly you drill it first in the normal drill set, and then use the hammer drill mode and then go in all the way to 2 or 3 inches. Then I put in a few wall plugs as normal, and then screwed it in place with an impact driver. I didn't drive it in fully, I just drove it in such a way that it's a bit loose in its setting, and after that I came back with a handheld screwdriver and tightened it up properly. If you over tighten this thing up, the whole body could flex a bit, and if it flexes, you won't be able to actually close the lid properly. Once it's all done, put in the small grey caps to cover the screw holes, and then tighten the lid. With the lid tightened, I next went in and attached a few cable cleats to hold the cable in place. Now back on the other side. So here I just stripped out the end of the SWA cable which comes on the power controller, and it's going to fit right into the junction box which we wired in earlier. Now if you see all the wires, it may look like a dog's dinner, and believe me, it's not that complicated. All it has is a live, a neutral and an earth. So I'm going to use a 13 amp connector block and make sure I connect all the wires together properly. The connector block gets its input power from the SWA cable coming in from the garage. Then it gets branched out to the double socket as well as to the 5-way switch. So to make it easier to understand, I'm going to show you this diagram which I got over here. So connect the neutral from the input power onto the connector block, and then the one from the double socket again on the same terminal, and one from the 5-way switch onto the other block. And repeat the same process for the live as well. For the earth, You need to connect the earth from the input power to the connector block, which gets connected to the double socket and which gets connected to the 5-way switch. And the additional thing which you have over here is the earthing tag on all these boxes. So you need to connect all that to a spare terminal and then wire in from that terminal back onto the earth cable. I hope you got that. And now just make sure you plug in all the cables in neatly and then put the rubber gasket around the box. And once it's all done, just screw in the cover and make sure that when you screw it in, that the edges are all completely sealed up. This is particularly important now that you got a whole lot of wire inside it. Now to connect the socket, it's basically again the same principle, that is a live neutral earth, and you need to connect the earth tag from the box also onto the terminals over here. So now let's take a closer look at it. The arrow mark indicates where the earth tag from the box gets connected to the socket. And the remaining 3 wires are pretty straightforward: neutral, live and earth. And once it's tightened up, make sure you gently tug on it to make sure that the screws are holding the conductors in place. And now just put the rubber feet back in. In this way, any rainwater or any other water which gets on the back of the box, it doesn't flow into the box. And now just screw it in to the actual housing itself. So just turn it on to make sure that the LED lights come up, and if it comes, job well done. And put the grey plastic tabs back on it so that the screws are also protected against rain. Now let's do a quick test. So I'm just going to try my orbital sander. It just happened to be the nearest tool lying in the other garage. And that's the result. As you see, that cable from that junction box goes all the way to this power controller, and even the switches over here work, so the wiring is perfect. Now it's the next day, and I can see there are a few rainwater or condensation which is formed inside the box. Well, actually this is normal because you got the rubber gasket running all over the outer box, so which means that no rainwater actually gets dripped onto the actual socket, and if at all it gets dripped, it'll just flow down and it'll just fall off from the box. Now for a quick tour. So the cable comes from the garage all the way from here, and let me just walk you through how to switch it on. So it gets tapped from this fuse spur box, which you connect to the spare socket over there, and once you turn that on, you get power outside. So the power gets delivered via the junction box onto the socket, and you can see that the socket works. And just going to retest it with an angle grinder this time, and that's on the second socket, and that works too. So now that that's done, let's go have a look at the 5-way power controller switch on the other side. And yes, that works as well. So I hope this video was useful, and if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below. If you have any suggestions on how it could have been improved, leave that also on it. Obviously there are a lot of footage which didn't make it into the final cut because the video was already coming close to 30 minutes or so. Two things which I did is that the spacing of the cable pleats, rather than 18 inches, I made that as 9 inches. I also dabbed a bead of silicone on all over the connector blocks so that no rainwater or dust can ingress into the boxes. So thanks for watching, and if you like what you see, give me a thumbs up, and please also consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you. Bye.